I should be dead right now. That's what the detective told my mother 3 months after I vanished. The statistics don't lie. Children who disappear for more than 72 hours rarely come home alive. But I did come home. 27 years later, I'm still trying to understand why I'm the exception and why the 2 other people in this story weren't as lucky. What I'm about to tell you happened in 1995, a year that swallowed 3 mysteries whole and never gave them back, until now. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm going to tell you about 3 cases that the world forgot, but that I've carried like stones in my chest ever since. Before I begin, I need you to do something for me if you've ever wondered what really happens in those moments when someone vanishes without explanation. If you've ever felt that cold shiver wondering if evil is closer than we think, subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video. Because these stories deserve to be heard, and the people in them deserve to be remembered. You owe them that much. We all do. The summer of 1995 tasted like copper and strawberries. I was 9 years old, living in a small town called Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where everyone knew everyone and nothing exciting ever happened. That's what we thought anyway, until June 14th, when Thomas Hendricks disappeared from the annual summer fair. I remember that night with the kind of clarity that trauma brands into your brain. The Ferris wheel lights painting circles in the dark sky, the smell of funnel cakes and grease, my mother's hand slipping out of mine as I stopped to look at a game booth, just for a second. That's all it takes. 1 second and the world you know dissolves like sugar in rain. Thomas was 17. A local football star with a scholarship to Penn State already lined up. Everyone loved him. The kind of kid who helped elderly neighbors carry groceries and still found time to volunteer at the animal shelter. He was working the dunk tank that night, laughing as kids threw baseballs at the target, trying to send him splashing into the water. I watched him for a while because I had the biggest crush on him, the way 9-year-old girls do, all innocent and worshipful. At 9:47 p.m., Thomas took his break. Security footage from the parking lot shows him walking toward the portable restrooms near the edge of the fairground. He never made it there. Or maybe he did. And what happened next erased him from existence so completely that even the dogs couldn't pick up a scent trail. The search began within 2 hours. By midnight, the entire town was combing through the woods surrounding the fairgrounds, flashlights cutting through the darkness like prayers. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a torn piece of clothing, not a single indication that Thomas Hendricks had ever existed beyond that grainy security footage showing him walking into the shadows. The investigation consumed Millbrook. FBI agents arrived, setting up headquarters in our elementary school gymnasium. They interviewed everyone who'd been at the fair, over 3,000 people. They drained the nearby reservoir. They brought in psychics, which tells you how desperate they were. Nothing. Thomas had been swallowed by the universe, and the universe wasn't talking. My father was one of the volunteer searchers. I remember him coming home at dawn, day after day, his eyes hollow and his clothes covered in burrs and mud. He wouldn't talk about what they were looking for in those woods, but I was old enough to understand. They'd stopped searching for a boy. They were searching for a body. Then, exactly 2 weeks after Thomas vanished, something happened that made the case even stranger. A woman named Darlene Kozak, 43 years old, disappeared from her home 15 miles away in the neighboring town of Ashford. She left behind a husband, 2 teenage daughters, and a pot of soup still simmering on the stove. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. The back door stood open, moving slightly in the breeze. And the police tried to treat them as separate cases at first. Coincidence, they said. Statistical anomaly, but people in small towns know better. We feel the patterns in our bones, the way animals sense earthquakes before they hit. Darlene wasn't like Thomas. She was quiet, kept to herself, worked as a bookkeeper for a local construction company. She didn't have enemies, didn't have secrets, at least none that anyone knew about. Her husband passed a polygraph test. Her daughters were cleared immediately. The FBI started looking at the possibility of a serial predator, someone who hunted in rural Pennsylvania, someone who knew how to make people disappear without leaving evidence. I didn't know Darlene Kozak personally, but I knew her youngest daughter, Rachel. We were in different grades. But small schools mean you recognize everyone's face. I saw her in the hallway 3 days after her mother vanished, and the look in her eyes haunted me for years afterward. It was like looking into a well with no bottom. The media descended on our quiet corner of Pennsylvania like locusts. News vans parked outside the police station. Reporters knocked on doors, shoving microphones into the faces of traumatized people, asking how it felt to live in fear. That's when the comparison started. They called it the Pennsylvania Triangle, drawing imaginary lines between disappearance points, looking for patterns in chaos, because patterns make us feel like the world makes sense. My mother stopped letting me play outside. She installed new locks on all our doors and windows. At night, I could hear her checking them over and over, the click of bolts sliding into place, becoming the soundtrack of my childhood anxiety. The town changed. People looked at each other differently, wondering if the monster was someone we knew, someone who smiled at us in the grocery store or sat beside us in church. August arrived with oppressive heat and no answers. The searches continued, but they became more sporadic, more hopeless. Volunteers dropped off as summer faded and reality set in. Thomas and Darlene were gone. Whatever had taken them had won. That's when I disappeared. August 23rd, 1995. Wednesday. I remember because it was trash day and I'd been arguing with my mother about taking out the recycling before school. Stupid, trivial things that seem so important until they're not. I walked to the bus stop alone that morning because my mother had to leave early for work. It was only 3 blocks. I'd done it 100 times. The bus stop was at the corner of Maple and 3rd, next to Mrs. Henderson's house, with its overgrown roses climbing the fence. 2 other kids waited there, Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen, both 6th graders who ignored me because I was just a baby 4th grader in their eyes. The bus was late. Not unusual. A man pulled up in a blue sedan. I can still see it perfectly. A Chevrolet Caprice, later model with a dent in the front passenger door. He rolled down his window and smiled. He had nice teeth, I remember thinking. Straight and white. "Hey kids," he said. "I'm supposed to pick you up. Your bus broke down." Jimmy and Melissa looked at each other skeptically. We'd all had the stranger danger talks, seen the videos in school, but this man didn't look dangerous. He wore a button-up shirt and glasses. He looked like someone's dad. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Melissa asked, crossing her arms. The man pulled out a badge. "I'm with the school district. They called me to transport students on Maple Street until they can get a replacement bus here. You can call the school if you want, but you'll be late." Something in me went cold. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way his smile didn't reach his eyes. Maybe it was how his hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Or maybe it was something deeper, some animal instinct that evolution gave us for exactly these moments. "I need to use the bathroom," I said suddenly. "I'll wait for the next bus." I turned and started walking toward Mrs. Henderson's house, my heart hammering. Behind me, I heard Melissa say, "Yeah, we should probably call first." The man's voice changed then, losing its friendly warmth, becoming something flat and cold. "Get in the car, now." I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, straight up Mrs. Henderson's driveway, pounding on her door and screaming. She opened it, confused and alarmed, and I shoved past her into the house, gasping about the man, the car, the other kids. By the time she called 911 and we looked outside, the blue sedan was gone. So were Jimmy and Melissa. The guilt hit me immediately, a crushing weight that 9-year-old shoulders weren't built to carry. I'd saved myself and abandoned them. While police cars screamed through our neighborhood and helicopters circled overhead, I sat in Mrs. Henderson's living room and understood that I was alive because I'd been a coward. The manhunt that followed was unprecedented. Every police officer in 3 counties mobilized. The FBI called in additional resources. Roadblocks went up within 30 minutes. But the blue Caprice had vanished as completely as Thomas and Darlene, swallowed by the network of rural roads that spider-webbed through Pennsylvania's forests. I spent 6 hours being interviewed by detectives, describing everything I could remember about the man in his car: the dent in the passenger door, his glasses, wire-rimmed, I thought, but I wasn't sure, his voice, his hands. I drew pictures. They showed me books of mug shots until the faces blurred together into one composite nightmare. They found the car the next morning abandoned in a grocery store parking lot 40 miles away. It had been stolen 3 days earlier from Pittsburgh. Inside, they found nothing. No fingerprints, no fibers, nothing. It had been wiped clean with professional precision. Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen were gone. My parents decided to move immediately. They couldn't stay in Millbrook, couldn't wake up every day in a town where 5 people had been erased from existence in the span of 10 weeks. We left Pennsylvania that October, moving to Virginia, chasing the fantasy that geography could outrun trauma. But I never forgot. How could I? 3 unsolved disappearances, 2 more that were probably connected, and 1 traumatized 9-year-old girl who survived by accident. The detective who interviewed me said something I've never forgotten. "You're alive because you listened to your fear. Your instincts saved you." But they didn't save Jimmy and Melissa. That's what I couldn't reconcile. Why did my instincts work when theirs didn't? What would you have done in that moment? Would you have gotten in the car, trusting the badge and the smile? Or would you have run? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and I want to know if you think you would have survived. 27 years is a long time to carry questions that have no answers. I grew up, went to college, became a journalist, not by accident. Every story I've ever chased has been practice for the one I'm telling you now. Every investigation has been training for the moment I finally went back to Millbrook to find the truth about 1995. I returned last spring. The town had changed less than I expected. Main Street still had the same hardware store, the same diner with its peeling paint and neon sign. The fairgrounds where Thomas disappeared had been converted into a community park, as if Renaming trauma could erase it. I sat in my rental car outside that park for an hour before I could force myself to get out. The first person I contacted was Detective Robert Walsh, who'd led the original investigation. He was retired now, 73 years old, living in a modest house on the outskirts of town. When I called, he knew my name immediately. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice rough with age and cigarettes. "I wondered if you'd ever come back." We met at the diner. He looked older than 73, worn down by decades of carrying unsolved cases like anchors. He ordered coffee and pie, but didn't touch either one, just stared at them while I asked questions I'd been rehearsing for 27 years. "Did you ever have a suspect? Anyone at all?" Detective Walsh took a long breath. "We had hundreds of suspects, every registered sex offender in 3 states, every person who'd been at that fair, every stranger who'd passed through town in June. We investigated until there was nothing left to investigate. But you had a theory." He looked at me sharply. "Theories aren't evidence." "I don't care about evidence anymore, Detective. I care about truth." He was quiet for a long time, stirring sugar into coffee he wouldn't drink. Finally, he said, "There was a man. Worked as a contractor, moved from town to town following construction jobs. He'd been in Millbrook for about 8 months before Thomas disappeared working on a mall development project outside town. Name was Robert Finch. The name meant nothing to me, but I wrote it down anyway." "Why did you suspect him?" "He fit the profile. Transient, no close relationships, access to vehicles and tools. But more than that, he was at the fair the night Thomas vanished. We have him on security footage near the dunk tank area. And he'd done work at Darlene Kozak's house 3 months before she disappeared. Replaced her water heater." My pulse quickened. "That's 2 connections. Why wasn't he arrested?" "Because we had nothing but circumstantial coincidence. He passed a polygraph. Had alibis for both the night Thomas disappeared and the day Darlene vanished. Alibis that checked out. His vehicle didn't match the description of the blue Caprice. Though that doesn't mean much since that car was stolen. We searched his apartment, his work site, his storage unit. Nothing. Not a hair, not a fiber, not a photograph. He was clean. Where is he now?" Detective Walsh finally met my eyes. "That's the thing that's haunted me for 27 years, Sarah. Robert Finch left town 3 days after you escaped. Just packed up and drove away. We tracked him for a while. He went to Ohio, then Indiana, then he vanished. Social Security shows no activity after 1996. No tax returns, no driver's license renewals, nothing. Robert Finch disappeared as completely as the people we think he took. The implications hung between us like smoke. A predator who'd either died or become someone else entirely, starting over with a new name and new hunting grounds. Or maybe someone who'd accomplished what he'd set out to do and retired, satisfied. Did you check for similar cases in Ohio and Indiana?" "Of course." Walsh's voice was bitter. "Found 3 possibles in Ohio between 95 and 96, 2 in Indiana, all unsolved. All people who vanished without a trace. But we couldn't prove anything. The FBI tried to build a VICAP case, but without evidence, it was just pattern recognition and wishful thinking." I left the diner with a name and a new kind of horror. The understanding that what happened in Millbrook might have been just one chapter in a much longer, darker story. That night, I started building a file on Robert Finch, using every database and contact I'd developed over my career in journalism. What I found terrified me. Robert Finch had been born in 1963 in Pittsburgh, raised by a single mother who died when he was 16, bounced through foster care until he aged out of the system. No criminal record, which was unusual for someone who'd spent their adolescence in the foster system. Most kids came out with at least minor charges. He'd learned construction trade through a vocational program and had worked steadily from 1981 until 1995, then nothing. He became a ghost. But the pattern he'd left behind was visible if you knew how to look. I cross-referenced missing persons cases with his employment history, tracking him backwards through the towns where he'd worked. And I found them. 7 possible victims between 1988 and 1995, spread across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. All disappeared without a trace, all from small towns where Finch had worked construction jobs. None of the local police departments had connected them. Why would they? 7 disappearances across 7 years and 3 states. Each one treated as an isolated tragedy. Only someone looking for the pattern could see it. I was sitting in my hotel room, staring at the map I'd created with red pins marking disappearance locations, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Sarah Mitchell? The voice was male, older, careful. Who is this? My name is Marcus Hendricks. Thomas Hendricks was my brother. My breath stopped. I'd tried to contact the Hendricks family, but had been told they didn't want to discuss Thomas's disappearance. I'd respected that boundary, even though it meant missing a potential source. Mr. Hendricks, I know what you're doing, he interrupted. Detective Walsh called me. Told me you were asking questions about Robert Finch. He paused. I need to meet with you. There's something you need to know about the night Thomas disappeared. Something I've never told anyone. We met the next morning at the community park that had once been the fairgrounds. Marcus was 52 now, but grief had aged him beyond his years. We sat on a bench near where the dunk tank had been, and he told me a story that changed everything. Thomas called me that night, Marcus said, around 9:30, just before his break. He was spooked about something, said a man had been watching him all evening, just standing near the dunk tank, staring, not playing any games, not with any family, just watching. Did he describe him? Thomas said he wore a work jacket and a baseball cap, kept his hands in his pockets. Thomas thought about reporting it to security, but felt stupid. The guy wasn't doing anything illegal, just standing there. So Thomas called me instead, just to vent, you know. He said, "This guy's giving me the creeps, Marcus." Something about his eyes. I felt cold despite the warm spring sunshine. Did Thomas say anything else? Just that he was going to take his break and hope the guy would be gone when he got back. Marcus's voice cracked. That was the last time I heard my brother's voice. He said, "Talk to you tomorrow, bro." And then he was gone. For 27 years, I've lived with the fact that I was probably the last person he spoke to. And I didn't take him seriously. I didn't tell him to get security. I just said, "Stay safe, man," and hung up. You couldn't have known. Stop. Marcus's voice was sharp. Everyone says that. But I did know. That's the thing. I felt it too, that something was wrong. I just didn't act on it. And my brother paid the price for my cowardice. I understood his guilt intimately. We were members of the same terrible club, survivors who'd failed to save the people taken beside us. Marcus, did you tell the police this? I tried. But by the time I thought about it, 3 days had passed and I couldn't remember enough details. Man in a work jacket? Do you know how many men at a county fair wear work jackets? The police took my statement but said it wasn't actionable. They never found anyone matching that description on the security footage, though that doesn't mean much. Those cameras had huge blind spots. He pulled out his phone and showed me something. But I've been looking for him for 27 years, Sarah. Every face in every crowd. I see him in my nightmares. And 6 months ago, I think I finally saw him again. The photo on his phone showed a Home Depot parking lot. In the background, barely visible, was a man loading lumber into a truck. He wore a baseball cap pulled low, and the image quality wasn't great. But there was something about the set of his shoulders, the way he stood. Where was this taken? Harrisburg. I was visiting my daughter. I didn't approach him. I'm not stupid, but I took the photo and I've been trying to track him down ever since. The truck had no license plate visible. I went back to that Home Depot 4 times, but I never saw him again. I stared at the photo, trying to extract details from pixels and shadows. Could this be Robert Finch, 27 years, older but still alive, still free, still hunting? Or was it just another middle-aged man in work clothes, transformed into a monster by Marcus's grief and guilt? I'll find him, I told Marcus, and I meant it. Not because I thought I could succeed where police and FBI had failed, but because we both needed to believe that the truth was findable, that closure was possible, that the nightmare had an ending. The problem with obsession is that it's indistinguishable from dedication until it destroys you. I know this now, looking back at what I became in the months after meeting Marcus Hendricks. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night, stopped returning calls from friends and family. My editor at the magazine where I worked called 3 times before I finally texted back, "Following a story, need time off." She gave me 6 weeks. I used 12. My apartment in Virginia became a command center. I covered one entire wall with a timeline. 1988 to 1995, every disappearance I could connect to Robert Finch's employment history. I used string to link dates and locations, building a web that probably made me look insane but helped me see patterns. 7 victims before Millbrook. 7 people who'd vanished while Finch worked in their towns. But as I dug deeper, I realized the number was conservative. There could have been more. Disappearances I'd missed, cases that were never properly investigated, victims who weren't reported missing because they were transient or estranged from family. The profile that emerged was chilling in its calculation. Finch targeted a specific type: vulnerable people in their teens or middle-aged women, always from small towns, always during brief windows when he worked construction nearby. He never stayed anywhere longer than a year, never formed close relationships, lived in furnished apartments or extended stay motels, places where he could vanish overnight and leave nothing behind. I started tracking down people who'd worked with him. Most didn't remember him. He'd been 27 years earlier, and construction crews turn over constantly. But I found 3 former co-workers who had memories of Robert Finch. "Quiet guy," said Danny Martinez, who'd worked with Finch on the Millbrook Mall project. Kept to himself, competent worker, showed up on time, did his job, never caused problems. But yeah, now that you mention it, there was something off about him. He didn't join us for drinks after work, didn't talk about family or friends. Didn't seem to have a life outside the job site. We used to joke that he was a robot. Did he ever mention the fair? I asked. Or Thomas Hendricks? Danny thought for a moment. Actually, yeah. Day after that kid disappeared, everyone was talking about it, obviously. Finch was quiet, but I remember he said something like, "That's what happens when kids don't pay attention. World's full of predators." At the time, I thought he was just being cynical, but thinking about it now, he shuddered. Jesus, you think he was talking about himself? The second co-worker, a woman named Patricia Lee, remembered something else. Finch always volunteered for demolition work, she said. Most guys hate demo. It's hard, dirty work. But he loved it, especially when we were tearing down old buildings. He'd work for hours in these condemned houses, clearing them out before the bulldozers came. Said he liked the solitude. I felt something click into place. What happened to the buildings after demolition? Hauled to the dump usually, or if they were in areas being developed, the debris got buried as fill for the new construction. My mind raced. If Finch had been killing people for years, he'd needed somewhere to hide the bodies. And what better place than in buildings scheduled for demolition, where the evidence would be pulverized and buried under tons of concrete and steel? I started mapping demolition sites that corresponded with Finch's employment timeline. In Millbrook alone, 4 buildings had been demolished between June and September 1995. 2 old houses, a barn, and a warehouse. All were now buried under the mall parking lot where Finch had worked. If I was right, Thomas Hendricks, Darlene Kozak, and possibly others were under that asphalt, mixed with the rubble of demolished buildings, hidden so thoroughly that even cadaver dogs wouldn't detect them through layers of concrete and earth. I took my theory to Detective Walsh. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Finally, he said, "Sarah, do you know what it would take to excavate a mall parking lot based on a theory? The warrants alone would be impossible without evidence. And even if we got them, do you know how much it would cost to dig up acres of asphalt and earth? Millions. For what might be nothing." "It's not nothing," I insisted. "It's the only theory that explains how he hid the body so completely." "I believe you," Walsh said, surprising me. "I think you're probably right. But the system doesn't work on probability, it works on proof, and we don't have any." I left his office feeling defeated but not deterred. If the system wouldn't help, I'd have to find another way. That's when I decided to find Robert Finch myself. I created a profile on every contractor database I could access, cross-referencing with the photo Marcus had taken. I contacted construction companies across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, showing them Finch's old driver's license photo and asking if they'd employed anyone matching his description. Most ignored me. A few responded with polite rejections. But one, a small construction company in Columbus, Ohio, responded with something interesting. "We had a guy working for us from 2001 to 2003 who looked similar," the manager wrote back. "Went by the name Richard Finley. Good worker, kept to himself. Left without notice one day and never came back for his last paycheck. I tried to track him down to send it, but the address he'd given us was fake." Richard Finley. Same initials, same pattern of behavior, same vanishing act. I was on the next flight to Columbus. The construction company's records gave me a starting point. Richard Finley had worked on residential developments, installing drywall. The manager showed me his employment application. Minimalist information, no emergency contacts, a P.O. box address that had been closed years ago. "Do you have any photos of him?" I asked desperately. The manager shook his head. This was before everyone had digital cameras on their phones. We didn't document workers back then, but... He paused, thinking. "There was a company barbecue in 2002. My wife took photos. Let me see if I still have them." He did. In a dusty box in his garage, buried under tax returns and old bills, he found an envelope of printed photographs. We went through them one by one. Shots of workers eating hamburgers, playing horseshoes, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear. Then I saw him. In the background of a group photo, slightly out of focus, was a man who'd turned away from the camera at the last second. You could only see his profile, but it was enough. The shape of his face, the way he held himself. I pulled out the old driver's license photo of Robert Finch and held them side by side. "That's him," I whispered. "That's Robert Finch." The manager looked at the photos and frowned. "You sure? I mean, they look similar, but I'm sure." And I was. After months of staring at Finch's face, I could have picked him out of a crowd of thousands. But confirmation wasn't enough. I needed to find where Richard Finley had gone after leaving Columbus. The trail was nearly 20 years old, but I had tools that didn't exist in 1995. I had the internet, social media, databases that tracked everything. I spent 2 weeks in Columbus following digital breadcrumbs. I searched for Richard Finley in every database I could access. Court records, utility bills, voting registrations. I found 3 men with that name in Ohio, none of whom were my target. But I did find something else. In 2003, 3 months after Richard Finley left the construction company, a 19-year-old college student named Jennifer Adams disappeared from her off-campus apartment in Columbus. No signs of struggle, no evidence of where she'd gone. The case went cold within weeks. The pattern continued. Columbus to Cincinnati, where a man matching Finch's description had worked for a roofing company in 2004. A middle-aged woman named Carol Preston vanished from Cincinnati that same year. Then Indianapolis, where he'd worked briefly in 2005, and where 2 disappearances occurred within 6 months. He was still hunting, still moving, still erasing people from existence. But somewhere around 2006, the trail went completely cold. No more Richard Finley, no more similar disappearances in the region. Either Finch had died, been arrested for something unrelated, or he'd changed his pattern so dramatically that I couldn't recognize it anymore. I flew back to Virginia, exhausted and frustrated. I'd proven, at least to myself, that Robert Finch was a serial killer responsible for at least a dozen disappearances. But I had no way to stop him because I couldn't find him. Every lead ended in nothing. Every database search came back empty. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at my wall of evidence, when my phone rang. Unknown number again. I answered it without thinking. "Sarah Mitchell?" The voice was electronically distorted, unrecognizable. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what you're looking for." A pause. "Robert Finch is alive, and I can tell you where to find him. But you have to come alone, and you have to come now." Every instinct screamed trap. This was how horror movies started, with the protagonist making a stupid decision that got them killed. But I also knew this might be my only chance. "Where?" I asked. "There's an abandoned warehouse at 1847 Industrial Boulevard, Harrisburg. Come tonight at midnight. Come alone, or you'll never get another chance." The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, my heart hammering. This was insane. I should call Detective Walsh. I should call the police. I should do anything except walk into an obvious trap. But I knew I was going to go, because after 27 years of questions, someone was finally offering answers. And I'd take any chance, no matter how dangerous, to find them. The warehouse district of Harrisburg looks like the apocalypse came early and decided to stay. Abandoned buildings with broken windows stare at you like empty eye sockets. Graffiti covers every surface, not art, just chaos and spray paint. The kind of place where bad things happen and no one hears you scream. I pulled up to 1847 Industrial Boulevard at 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, because I wanted to scout the area. My headlights cut through darkness thick enough to taste. The warehouse was exactly what you'd imagine. Rusted metal siding, collapsed sections of roof, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. I'd made one smart decision. I'd texted Detective Walsh the address and told him that if he didn't hear from me by 1 a.m., he should send police. It wasn't much of a safety net, but it was something. My hand shook as I checked my phone. 11:53. 7 minutes until midnight. I'd brought a flashlight and pepper spray, though what good either would do against someone like Robert Finch, I didn't know. Men who'd successfully hidden bodies for decades didn't make mistakes that pepper spray could fix. I got out of the car. The night was warm, but I felt cold. That deep in the bones cold that comes from fear, not temperature. The warehouse door hung open, a mouth waiting to swallow me. Hello? My voice sounded small and pathetic. No answer. But there was light inside, flickering like candles or a lantern. Someone was already there, waiting. I stepped through the door into a space that smelled of rust and decay. The floor was littered with debris, broken pallets, shattered glass, things I didn't want to identify in the darkness. The light came from the far corner, where someone had set up battery-powered lanterns around a cleared space. A figure stood in the center of that light. Male, average height, wearing jeans and a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. I couldn't see his face. Sarah Mitchell, the figure said. The voice wasn't distorted anymore, but it was rough, like gravel in a blender. You've been looking for me. My breath stopped. Robert Finch? The figure laughed, a sound without humor. Is that what you think? That I'd call you here to introduce myself? The hood came down, and I saw his face. He was younger than Finch would be, maybe early 40s, with a scar running down his left cheek. Not Robert Finch, someone else entirely. Who are you? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. My name is David Kozak. Darlene Kozak was my mother. The world tilted. Quinolder Darlene Kozak's son. I'd read about him in the case files. He'd been 14 when his mother disappeared, had been living with his father. The police had cleared him immediately. Why did you bring me here? Because you're asking the right questions, and I have information you need. He gestured to a folding chair he'd set up. Sit, please, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm trying to help. I didn't sit. Then help. Tell me what you know. David Kozak took a deep breath. My mother didn't vanish randomly. She was investigating something that got her killed. What are you talking about? The police said what they believed, which wasn't the truth. My mother was a bookkeeper, right? She kept books for Harmon Construction, the company that built the Millbrook Mall. 3 weeks before she disappeared, she found discrepancies in the accounts. Lots of material being purchased but not accounted for in the actual construction. She thought someone was embezzling. I felt pieces clicking together. Robert Finch worked for Harmon Construction. Exactly. My mother started investigating. She didn't go to the police because she wasn't sure yet, wanted to have solid evidence. She was methodical like that, but she kept a journal, wrote down everything she found. After she disappeared, I found that journal hidden in our attic. I was 14. I didn't know what to do with it, didn't understand what it meant. So I hid it. Why didn't you go to the police? Because I was terrified, David said simply. My mother had disappeared, someone had taken her, and she retried D continued written in her journal that if anything happened to her, we should look at Robert Finch. But Finch had an alibi. The police cleared him. I was just a kid who'd lost his mother, who was going to believe me over an FBI investigation. He pulled out a worn notebook from his jacket. I kept this for 27 years, waiting until I was brave enough to do something with it. Then I saw your articles, saw that you were asking questions about Finch, and I thought maybe together we could finally prove what he did. I took the journal with shaking hands. Inside, in neat handwriting, Darlene Kozak had documented her investigation. Receipts for materials never delivered, payments to subcontractors who didn't exist, and notes about Robert Finch, how he seemed to be at the center of the financial irregularities, how he had access to the construction site at odd hours, how he'd been working there during demolition phases. And then, on the last page, before the entries stopped, confronted RF today about the discrepancies. He denied everything but looked at me strangely. I'm worried. If anything happens to me, investigate Robert Finch. 2 days later, Darlene Kozak had vanished. She knew, I whispered. She figured out he was using the construction site to hide bodies, or at least that something wrong was happening there and he killed her for it. That's what I think, David said. But here's the thing. I don't think Finch was working alone. I looked up sharply. What? The financial records my mother documented show 2 sets of signatures on the fraudulent orders. One was Finch's. The other belonged to the site supervisor, a man named Gerald McKay. I think McKay was helping Finch, either knowingly or unknowingly. Maybe Finch was using McKay's access and authority to cover his tracks. Where's McKay now? David smiled grimly. That's why I brought you here. Gerald McKay lives in Harrisburg. Has for the past 15 years. Works as a contractor, owns his own small company. And I've been watching him. Watching him? David, that's necessary, he interrupted. I've spent my entire adult life trying to find out what happened to my mother. McKay might be our connection to Finch. If we can prove McKay was involved, maybe he'll tell us where Finch is now. Or maybe McKay is innocent and you're stalking him. Possible, David acknowledged, but I don't think so. McKay left Millbrook 2 weeks after my mother disappeared. Moved to Harrisburg and started over, just like Finch. That's not a coincidence. I stared at the journal, my mind racing. Everything David was saying made a terrible kind of sense. But it was also the kind of theory that could be built entirely from grief and confirmation bias. Why now? I asked. Why contact me now after all these years? David's face changed, became harder. Because 3 months ago, a 22-year-old woman named Amanda Bishop disappeared from her apartment in Harrisburg. No signs of struggle, no evidence of where she went. Just vanished, exactly like my mother, exactly like Thomas Hendricks, exactly like all of Finch's victims. The cold I'd felt earlier intensified. You think Finch is here in Harrisburg? I think he never left the area. I think he's been operating under a new identity for years, and he's still hunting. And I think Gerald McKay knows where he is. I made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt necessary. Where does McKay live? David pulled out his phone and showed me an address. Are you in? I thought about Detective Walsh, about the text I'd sent him, about all the rules I was about to break. Then I thought about Thomas Hendricks walking into the darkness and never coming back, about Darlene Kozak leaving soup on the stove, about Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen, who'd gotten into a blue sedan because they trusted a badge and a smile. I'm in, I said, but we do this smart. No confrontations. We gather evidence and take it to the police. Agreed? David nodded, but I saw something in his eyes that worried me. He wasn't looking for evidence. He was looking for revenge. And I just agreed to help him get it. Gerald McKay's house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave to their neighbors. Nothing about it suggested evil or conspiracy. That's the thing about monsters, they rarely advertise. We parked 3 houses down, sitting in my rental car as dawn broke over Harrisburg. David had been watching McKay's routines for weeks. He left for work every morning at 7:15, came home around 6 p.m., lived alone after his divorce 5 years ago. What's the plan? I asked. We wait until he leaves, then we search his house. That's breaking and entering. You have a better idea? I didn't. That was the problem. Everything about this felt wrong. But everything about the past 27 years had been wrong too. Sometimes you have to break rules to fix what's broken. At 7:13, Gerald McKay emerged from his house. He was in his 60s now, gray-haired and thick around the middle, wearing work boots and carrying a thermos. He looked like someone's grandfather, not an accomplice to serial murder. He got into a pickup truck and drove away. David and I waited 10 minutes to be sure he wasn't coming back, then approached the house. David had lockpicks. Of course he did. He'd been preparing for this moment for years. If we get caught, I started. We won't get caught. McKay's job sites are all at least an hour away. We have time? The lock clicked open embarrassingly easily. We stepped inside, and I felt like I was crossing a threshold I'd never be able to uncross. Whatever we found in here would change things irreversibly. The house was surprisingly neat. Clean dishes in the sink. Mail stacked on the counter. Nothing suspicious or alarming. We split up. David took the upstairs. I searched the main floor. I started in the living room, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Photo albums showed a normal life. McKay at construction sites, at family gatherings, on fishing trips. His divorce hadn't been pleasant, apparently. All the photos with his ex-wife had been removed, leaving gaps in the albums like missing teeth. The kitchen yielded nothing, same with the dining room. I was starting to think this was a waste of time when David called from upstairs, his voice tight. "Sarah, get up here." I took the stairs 2 at a time. David was in a small office, standing in front of an open closet. Inside, covering every inch of the wall, were newspaper clippings about the Millbrook disappearances. My heart stopped. Articles about Thomas Hendricks, about Darlene Kozak, about Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen. Dozens of articles, some yellowed with age, all carefully preserved. And in the center, a photograph I recognized immediately. The security footage of Thomas walking toward the restrooms. The last image of him alive. "He's been following the case," David said. His voice shook with barely contained rage. "For 27 years he's kept these. Why would an innocent man obsessively collect articles about crimes unless he was involved. I wanted to argue, to suggest alternative explanations, but I couldn't. This went beyond interest or curiosity. This was obsession, the kind of obsession that came from guilt or fascination with your own crimes. I started photographing everything with my phone. Evidence. We needed evidence that would hold up in court. But as I documented the clippings, I noticed something else. Small handwritten notes on some of the articles. Dates and locations that didn't match the original disappearances. David, look at this. One article about Darlene Kozak had a note in the margin. Similar, Columbus 2003, Cincinnati 2004. Another article about Thomas had a note. Refined method, too public. He's been tracking Finch's other victims, I said slowly. These notes, they correspond with the disappearances I found. Columbus, Cincinnati, Indianapolis. McKay knows about all of them. Because he's helping Finch, David said. He has to be. No one keeps this kind of documentation unless they're involved. I photographed the notes, my hands shaking. This was enough to take to the police. This was proof of knowledge, if not direct involvement. But before I could say anything, we heard it. The sound of a truck pulling into the driveway. David and I froze, staring at each other in horror. McKay was home. We had maybe 30 seconds before he came through the front door. Basement, David hissed. There's a basement entrance outside. We can get out that way. We ran. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, into a small utility room where stairs led down into darkness. I could hear the front door opening as we descended into the basement, pulling the door shut behind us as quietly as possible. The basement was unfinished. Concrete floor, exposed beams, that smell of dampness and old concrete. A single window near the ceiling provided weak light. We crouched behind a stack of boxes, hardly breathing, listening to footsteps above us. McKay was moving around upstairs. Had he forgotten something? Or had he noticed signs of our intrusion? I'd been careful, but maybe not careful enough. Every second stretched into eternity. Then I saw it. On the far wall of the basement, partially hidden behind an old furnace, was a door. Not a normal door, a metal door, the kind you'd see on a bunker or storage locker. It had a serious padlock on it. David saw it too. We looked at each other, the same question in both our eyes. What was behind that door? The footsteps upstairs stopped, then started again, moving toward the utility room, toward the basement stairs. He knows we're here, David whispered. We were trapped. The outside basement entrance David had mentioned was on the far side of the room, past that locked metal door. To reach it, we'd have to cross open space where McKay would see us immediately when he came down the stairs. The utility room door opened. Light spilled down the stairs. McKay's shadow appeared, long and distorted on the basement wall. I know someone's down here, McKay called out. His voice was calm, almost friendly. I saw your car parked down the street. Not a very subtle surveillance vehicle, Sarah Mitchell. My blood turned to ice. He knew my name. He'd been expecting this. McKay descended the stairs slowly, deliberately. When he reached the bottom, he was holding a gun. Nothing dramatic, just a simple handgun, but pointed directly at where David and I crouched behind the boxes. Come out, McKay said. Both of you, hands where I can see them. We emerged slowly. David's face was white with fury and fear. I tried to keep my expression neutral, tried to think of something to say that would de-escalate this situation. Mr. McKay, we just want to talk. You broke into my house, McKay interrupted. Went through my things. Found my collection, I assume. He gestured at the ceiling, meaning the upstairs office. That must have been quite illuminating. "Why do you have all those articles?" I asked, trying to keep him talking. "Detective Walsh would call police when I didn't check in. We just had to stay alive long enough for help to arrive." McKay smiled sadly. "Because I've been trying to solve the case for 27 years. The same case you're investigating. I'm not your enemy, Sarah. I'm your ally. Or I was until you decided to break into my house like common criminals." "You knew Robert Finch," David said, his voice hard. "You worked with him. You signed off on the fraudulent orders that my mother discovered." McKay's expression changed, became pained. "Is that what you think? That I helped him?" He laughed bitterly. "I'm the reason your mother is dead, David. But not for the reason you imagine." He sat down on the stairs, still holding the gun but no longer pointing it directly at us. He suddenly looked older, exhausted by the weight of whatever he was carrying. "I'm going to tell you a story," McKay said, "and when I'm done, you're going to understand why I've spent the last 27 years living in hell." "I met Robert Finch in 1994, McKay began, his voice distant like he was reading from an old script. "He was transferred to the Millbrook project as a general laborer, good worker, like everyone said. Quiet, reliable, the kind of employee you never worry about. I was the site supervisor. It was my job to know everyone, to manage the crew, to keep the project on schedule. Finch and I worked together for about 8 months before things started feeling wrong. Little things at first. Materials that were ordered but never showed up. Receipts that didn't match inventory. I thought it was accounting errors, maybe a supplier screwing up. But then Darlene Kozak came to me." McKay's hands tightened on the gun. Not threatening, just holding it like a security blanket. "She showed me what she'd found. Systematic fraud in the material orders. Someone was billing Harmon Construction for supplies that never existed, pocketing the difference. The amount wasn't huge, maybe $20,000 over 6 months, but it was consistent. And the signatures on the fraudulent orders were mine and Finch's." "You were embezzling together," David said accusingly. "No," McKay said sharply. "I never signed those orders. Someone had forged my signature. But Darlene didn't know that. She thought I was involved. She came to me not to accuse, but to warn me that she was going to have to report it. She felt bad about it. Thought maybe I'd gotten in over my head, needed the money for something. She was giving me a chance to confess and make it right. I saw where this was going." "You told Finch?" "I told Finch," McKay confirmed, his voice full of self-loathing. "I went to him the same day, confronted him about the forged signatures. I thought he'd panic, maybe confess, maybe we could figure out a way to fix it without involving police. But Finch just looked at me with these empty eyes and said, 'You're not going to report it.' It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, and I didn't understand what he meant until 2 days later, when Darlene disappeared." David made a sound like he'd been gut-punched. McKay continued, relentless. "I knew immediately, couldn't prove it, but I knew. Finch had killed her to protect himself from the embezzlement charge, and when I tried to go to the police, he sent me a message, a photograph." McKay pulled out his phone with his free hand, thumbed through it, and turned it to show us an image. It was old, faded, but clear enough. 2 young girls, maybe 8 and 10 years old, playing in a backyard. "My daughters," McKay said. "That photo was taken from outside my house." Finch included a note. "Beautiful children. Would be a shame if something happened to them." I got it the day before I was supposed to give my statement to the FBI. I felt sick. He threatened your children. He owned me after that. I couldn't go to the police without putting my family at risk. And Finch knew it. He knew exactly how to control me. So I stayed quiet. Told the FBI I didn't know anything about the embezzlement, that the signatures must have been forged. They investigated, found nothing, moved on, and Finch disappeared. But you kept collecting the articles, I said. Why? Because I couldn't let it go. My silence had let a monster escape. Thomas Hendricks, those 2 children at the bus stop, they all died because I was a coward. So I tracked every disappearance I could find that matched Finch's pattern. Every town he'd worked in, every victim he'd left behind. I documented everything, hoping that someday I'd find a way to bring him to justice without risking my family. McKay set the gun down on the stairs beside him, a gesture of trust or maybe surrender. When my daughters grew up and moved away, I thought about going public. But by then, Finch had vanished so completely that I had nothing concrete to offer police. Just my theories and a collection of newspaper clippings. Without evidence, I'd just be a crazy old man obsessed with cold cases. The metal door, David said suddenly. Behind the furnace. What's in there? McKay's expression became even more pained. Everything I've collected over 27 years. Documents, notes, maps of possible burial sites. Evidence that wouldn't hold up in court but might help someone with more resources than me. Open it, I said, please. We need to see. McKay stood slowly, picked up the gun again, but held it loosely, pointing at the floor. I'll open it. But what you're going to see, well, it's going to make you understand why I've lived in hell for almost 3 decades. He led us to the metal door, pulled out a key, and unlocked it. Inside was a small room, maybe 8 by 10 feet, lit by a single bulb. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, timelines, a more extensive version of what I'd created in my apartment, but with 27 years of accumulated detail. But it was the center of the room that made my breath stop. A corkboard, 6 feet wide, covered with photographs. Not of victims, but of one man, Robert Finch, or the many identities he'd used. Pictures from different years, different places, showing how he'd aged, how his appearance had changed. McKay had been tracking him the entire time. Richard Finley in Columbus, 2001, McKay said, pointing to one cluster of photos. Raymond Fisher in Indianapolis, 2005. Ronald Feldman in Pittsburgh, 2010. He changes his name but always keeps the same initials. RF. Like a signature he can't help leaving. I stared at the photos, watching Finch age across the years. Hair graying, face becoming more lined, but always the same empty eyes. The most recent photo was dated 6 months ago. Where is this from? I asked, pointing to the recent image. Security footage from a Home Depot in Harrisburg, McKay said. The same one where Marcus Hendricks saw him. I've been tracking him for the past year. He's here, using the name Russell Fletcher now, and he's hunting again. Amanda Bishop, David said. The woman who disappeared 3 months ago? McKay nodded grimly. I think so, but I have no proof. Just my certainty that Finch's pattern continues. I felt overwhelmed by the scope of what McKay had uncovered. This wasn't just evidence of Finch's crimes. It was a roadmap of a serial killer's entire career, documented by a man whose guilt had consumed his life. Why didn't you send this to the police? I asked. Because by myself, I'm just an obsessed conspiracy theorist, but you... He looked at me intently. You're a journalist with credibility. You've been asking the right questions, making connections that match what I've found. Together, we might actually be able to prove what Finch has done. Get justice for all his victims. And save the next one, David added. If he's hunting again, there's someone out there right now who's in danger. McKay nodded. There's always someone in danger when Robert Finch is around. The question is, are you willing to help me stop him? I looked at the wall of evidence. At 27 years of one man's desperate attempt at redemption, I thought about all the lives Finch had destroyed, all the families still searching for answers. I thought about that 9-year-old girl at the bus stop who'd survived by accident and had spent her whole life trying to understand why. Yes, I said, I'll help you. But we do this the right way. We take this evidence to the FBI, to Detective Walsh, to everyone who'll listen, and we make sure it sticks this time. McKay smiled for the first time since we'd met. I was hoping you'd say that because I know where Finch is right now, and I know his next target. He pointed to a map on the wall, a residential area circled in red marker. There's a woman who lives here, single, early 40s, works from home as a freelance designer. She matches Finch's victim profile perfectly, and I've seen him watching her house 3 times in the past week. My heart raced. We need to warn her. Get her to safety. We will, McKay agreed. But more than that, we're going to use her as bait. We're going to catch Robert Finch in the act with witnesses and evidence that even the best lawyer can't explain away. David shook his head. That's insane. We can't put someone in danger like that. She's already in danger, McKay countered. Finch has chosen her. If we warn her and she leaves, he'll just pick someone else. But if we're smart, if we set this up correctly, we can end this. After 27 years, we can finally stop him. I understood what McKay was proposing, a trap, with a potential victim as the lure. It was dangerous, probably illegal, and definitely something that could go catastrophically wrong. But it was also the first real chance we'd had to catch Finch red-handed. What do you need from us? I asked. McKay's smile widened. Everything. I've been alone in this for too long. But with the 3 of us working together, we can do what the FBI couldn't. We can end Robert Finch's hunting season permanently. The woman's name was Catherine Wells, and she had no idea that death had been watching her through her windows for the past week. She lived in a modest 2-story house on Riverside Avenue, worked as a graphic designer, and according to McKay's surveillance, followed a predictable routine that made her an easy target. We debated for hours about whether to warn her or use her as unknowing bait. David insisted on telling her. Putting her in danger without consent was wrong. Period. McKay argued that Finch would sense a trap if Catherine's behavior changed. I sat between them, trying to find a middle path. We tell her, I finally decided, but we do it carefully. We explain the situation and give her the choice. If she agrees to help, we protect her. If she refuses, we move her to safety and find another way. McKay looked unhappy but nodded. Fine. But we approach her carefully. If Finch is watching, he can't see us making contact. That night, we waited until Catherine's lights went out at 11 p.m., then gave it another hour for good measure. At midnight, I knocked on her door while David and McKay watched from a car down the street, scanning for any sign of Finch. Catherine answered the door in a bathrobe, her hair in a messy bun, looking confused and worried. Can I help you? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a journalist, and I need to talk to you about your safety. Can I come in, please? It's urgent. Something in my voice must have convinced her, because she let me inside, though she kept her phone in her hand, ready to call 911. Smart woman, I told her everything about Robert Finch and his 27-year killing spree, about the pattern of victims, about McKay's surveillance showing Finch watching her house. Catherine listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Show me proof." I pulled out my phone and showed her everything. The photos of Finch, McKay's documentation, news articles about the disappearances. Catherine studied each image carefully, her designer's eye looking for inconsistencies or signs of manipulation. Finally, she set the phone down. "This is real. You're actually telling me there's a serial killer stalking me?" "Yes, and we have a plan to catch him, but it requires your help. If you're not comfortable, I'll do it," Catherine interrupted. "Whatever you need. If there's a chance to stop this man from hurting anyone else, I'm in." I was stunned by her immediate agreement. "You should think about this. It could be dangerous." "My little sister disappeared in 1998, Catherine said quietly, "from a small town in West Virginia. Police never found her, never found any evidence. Case went cold within months. I've spent 20 years wondering what happened to her, wondering if the person who took her ever faced justice. If I can help give other families the closure I never got, I'm doing it." And just like that, we had our bait. Someone who understood what was at stake and was willing to risk everything to stop it. We spent the next 2 days preparing. McKay installed hidden cameras around Catherine's house, in the trees, in the eaves, in the bushes. David contacted Detective Walsh and laid out our plan. Walsh was horrified at first, threatened to shut the whole thing down, but when we showed him McKay's evidence, his resistance crumbled. "This is either the most brilliant or the most insane thing I've ever seen," Walsh said, studying the wall of documentation in McKay's basement. "If it works, Finch goes away forever. If it fails..." He didn't finish the sentence. We all knew the stakes. Walsh agreed to coordinate with local police, but insisted on keeping the operation small. Too many officers and Finch would sense the trap. Instead, we'd have plainclothes detectives positioned nearby, ready to move in the moment Finch made his approach. Catherine maintained her normal routine, but now every moment was documented. Every trip to the grocery store, every evening working in her home office with the curtains open. Every predictable movement designed to make her seem vulnerable and accessible. Finch watched from the shadows. McKay's cameras caught him twice, once parked down the street in a nondescript sedan, once walking past the house at 2 a.m. He was studying her, learning her patterns, planning his attack. "It'll happen soon," McKay predicted. "He's been watching for a week. His pattern suggests he moves within 10 days of selecting a victim. We're running out of time." He was right. On the 8th night, things escalated. I was monitoring the camera feeds from McKay's basement command center when I saw him. A figure moving through Catherine's backyard, testing windows, checking doors. He was dressed in dark clothes, wearing gloves, moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. "He's there," I said into the radio. "Backyard, moving toward the kitchen door." In the car parked 2 houses down, Detective Walsh acknowledged, "Eyes on, do not engage until he's inside. We need him committing a felony before we move." David was with Catherine inside her house, hiding in the upstairs bedroom with her. both of them armed with pepper spray and phones. The plan was for them to stay hidden while Finch broke in, giving police time to surround the house and trap him inside. I watched Finch examine the kitchen door lock. He pulled out tools, professional lockpicks, not amateur equipment. Within 90 seconds, the door swung open. He stepped inside Catherine's house, and my heart nearly stopped. "He's inside," I reported. "Kitchen entry, moving toward the living room." "Copy," Walsh responded, "teams moving into position." But something felt wrong. Finch was moving too confidently, too directly. He wasn't searching the house randomly. He was walking with purpose toward the stairs, toward where Catherine and David were hiding. "He knows," I said suddenly. "He knows it's a trap." "How could he?" McKay started, but then we both saw it. Finch pulled out a gun from his jacket. Not to threaten or intimidate. He was holding it like someone who intended to use it. "Walsh, he's armed," I shouted into the radio. "He's heading upstairs and he's armed." Everything happened fast after that. Walsh gave the order to breach immediately. Police poured into Catherine's house from front and back simultaneously. Finch heard them coming and ran, not away from the stairs, but up them, toward David and Catherine. I watched helplessly on the camera feeds as Finch kicked open the bedroom door. David stepped in front of Catherine, holding the pepper spray, but Finch was faster. He shot David twice in the chest, the sound impossibly loud even through the camera's cheap microphone. Catherine screamed. Finch turned toward her, raising the gun, and I thought I was watching her die. But before he could fire, Detective Walsh appeared in the doorway and shot Finch in the shoulder. Finch went down, the gun skittering across the floor. 3 more officers piled into the room, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Walsh kicked Finch's gun away and handcuffed him, while others attended to David. "Officer down," someone yelled. "We need paramedics now." I was already running out of McKay's basement, into my car, driving toward Catherine's house, with my heart in my throat. McKay was right behind me. The streets blurred past, every traffic light an eternity. When we arrived, the scene was controlled chaos. Ambulances, police cars, neighbors standing in their yards, watching the drama unfold. I pushed through the perimeter, showing my ID to officers who tried to stop me, until I reached Detective Walsh. "David?" I asked. Walsh's face was grim. "He's alive." Both shots hit his vest. We insisted he wear one. "He'll have broken ribs and one hell of a bruise, but he's going to make it." The relief nearly knocked me over. And Catherine? Shaken but unharmed. She's giving her statement now. Walsh looked at me seriously. "Your plan worked, Sarah. We got him. After 27 years, we finally got Robert Finch." They brought Finch out in handcuffs, blood soaking through his shirt from the shoulder wound. He looked older in person than in photographs, smaller somehow, diminished by capture. His eyes met mine as police led him past, and there was nothing there. No remorse, no fear, no humanity, just emptiness. "Sarah Mitchell," Finch said, his voice surprisingly soft. "The girl from the bus stop, I remember you." I couldn't speak. After 27 years of hunting him, of trying to understand why I'd survived when so many others hadn't, here he was, real, captured, defeated. "You ran," Finch continued. "Most of them don't run. Most of them trust the badge and the smile. But you ran, that's why you lived." "Where are they?" I found my voice. Thomas Hendricks, Darlene Kozak, Jimmy Parsons, Melissa Chen, all the others. Where did you put them? Finch smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. They're where they've always been, right under everyone's feet, hidden in plain sight. You'll never find them. We'll search every site you worked on, Walsh said. We'll excavate every demolition location. We'll find them. Maybe, Finch agreed, but it'll take years, decades, and even then, you'll never find them all. I've been very thorough. They put him in a police car and drove away. I stood in Catherine's yard, shaking with adrenaline and relief and rage, watching the man who'd haunted my entire life disappear into the criminal justice system. McKay appeared beside me. "It's over," he said quietly. "After 27 years, it's finally over." But I knew it wasn't over. Not really. Not until we found the victims and gave their families closure. Not until we understood the full scope of what Finch had done. That was going to be the work of the rest of my life. The arrest of Robert Finch made national news. "Serial killer caught after 27 years," the headline screamed. "Pennsylvania Triangle mystery solved." Media descended on Harrisburg like the plague, turning quiet Riverside Avenue into a circus of news vans and reporters doing stand-ups in front of Catherine's house. I gave one interview to 60 Minutes because they agreed to focus on the victims rather than Finch himself. I was tired of seeing his face on every screen, hearing his name in every conversation. He'd taken enough from us. I wasn't going to give him immortality too. The FBI opened a massive investigation into Finch's activities. They pulled employment records going back to 1985, tracking every town where he'd worked, cross-referencing with unsolved disappearances. The number kept growing, 12 victims, 15, 20. Each new connection, another family's tragedy, another life erased. David recovered from his injuries, but carried scars that went deeper than broken ribs. He'd looked into Finch's empty eyes and pulled the trigger on nothing but pepper spray while bullets hit his chest. That kind of trauma doesn't heal quickly, but something good came from it. David and Catherine fell in love during the aftermath, bonding over their shared experience of facing death and surviving. 6 months after Finch's arrest, they moved in together. A year later, they got married. I was the maid of honor, and Detective Walsh walked Catherine down the aisle since her father had passed away years before. At the reception, David made a toast. 27 years ago, my mother was taken from me. For most of my life, I've defined myself by that loss, by the need for revenge, by anger that consumed everything else. But standing here today, married to the most incredible woman I've ever met, I realize something. Robert Finch doesn't get to define my story anymore. My mother's legacy isn't her death. It's the love she gave me while she was alive. And the best revenge against someone who tried to break me is living a full, happy life. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. McKay testified at Finch's trial, finally unburdening himself of 27 years of guilt. He explained how Finch had threatened his daughters, how fear had silenced him, how that silence had enabled further deaths. His testimony destroyed Finch's defense. The jury convicted him on 7 counts of first-degree murder in just 3 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced him to 7 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Finch showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He simply stood there, empty and cold, already planning whatever twisted games he'd play in prison. But the legal victory didn't answer the question that kept me awake at night. Retry D continue? Where were the bodies? Finch refused to cooperate. He wouldn't confirm victim count, wouldn't reveal burial locations, wouldn't give families the closure they desperately needed. It was his final act of cruelty, taking their loved ones and keeping them even in death. So I did what I'd been training for my entire career. I investigated. Using McKay's documentation as a starting point, I built a comprehensive database of every construction site where Finch had worked. I cross-referenced with demolition records, environmental surveys, anything that might indicate where he'd hidden his victims. The FBI gave me access to their files, unprecedented cooperation, but they were as desperate as I was for answers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired construction worker named Phil Martinez, one of the men I'd interviewed early in my investigation, called me out of the blue. "I've been thinking about what you asked," Phil said, "about Finch and demolition work, and I remembered something. There was this old factory we demolished in 1994 just outside Millbrook. Finch volunteered to do the final cleanup, said he'd work overnight to meet the demolition deadline. At the time, I thought he was just being a good employee, but now..." "Where was this factory?" I asked, already pulling up maps on my computer. "Corner of Industrial and 5th. It's a shopping center now. They buried the foundation rubble as fill when they built the parking lot." My heart raced. "Phil, this is exactly what I need. Do you remember any other sites where Finch worked alone during demolition?" He gave me 3 more locations. All of them were now buried under new construction. A parking lot, a housing development, a community center. All of them in Millbrook, within the timeline of when Thomas and Darlene had disappeared. I took the information to Detective Walsh and the FBI. They got warrants to excavate all 4 sites. The legal process took months. Property owners fought it, claiming excavation would destroy their businesses. But eventually, the courts sided with the investigation. The excavation of the old factory site began on a cold November morning, exactly 28 years after Finch had first arrived in Millbrook. I stood behind police barriers with Marcus Hendricks, watching bulldozers tear through asphalt and earth, searching for his brother's remains. It took 3 days of careful digging. Then, on the 3rd day, the excavator stopped. A forensic anthropologist climbed down into the hole they'd created and spent 2 hours carefully brushing away dirt. When she emerged, her face was grave. "We found human remains, multiple individuals." The excavation shifted from construction equipment to careful archaeological work. Over the next 2 weeks, they recovered the remains of 4 people from that site. DNA testing confirmed what we all hoped and dreaded. Thomas Hendricks, Darlene Kozak, and 2 others we hadn't even known were missing. A transient man who'd never been reported, and a woman who'd been listed as a runaway in 1993. Marcus collapsed when they told him. I held him while he sobbed. 28 years of grief, finally finding release. "I can bury my brother," he kept saying. "After all this time, I can finally bury my brother." The 3 other sites yielded 5 more bodies. Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen, the children from my bus stop, were found together under what was now a community center playground. The irony of children playing above their graves felt like a final cruelty. But 3 victims were still missing from Millbrook, and likely dozens more from other towns. The FBI expanded excavations to other sites across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. Each new dig brought more families closure and more heartbreak. I watched from the sidelines as they worked, documenting everything for the book I was writing. This story needed to be told, not to glorify Finch, but to honor his victims and the people who'd never stopped searching for them. A year after his conviction, Finch agreed to an interview. He'd give it only to me, he said. One final game. I almost said no. I'd spent my entire life trying to understand this man, and I wasn't sure I wanted to finally hear his voice, his justifications, his twisted explanations for evil. But I agreed, because maybe there were still families who needed answers that only he could provide. The prison interview room was exactly what you'd imagine. Gray walls, metal table, guards watching through reinforced glass. Finch was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles shackled. He looked smaller than he had at his arrest, diminished by incarceration. He sat down across from me and smiled. Sarah Mitchell, you've done well. You found more of them than I expected. Where are the others? I asked without preamble. I wasn't here for small talk or psychological games. Why would I tell you? They're my only leverage, the only thing I have left that you want. You have no leverage. You're spending the rest of your life in prison. The only question is whether you die as the monster who taunted victims' families from prison, or whether you show a single shred of humanity in your final years. Finch studied me with those empty eyes. You want to understand why? That's what this is really about. Not the bodies, you'll find those eventually. You want to know what I was thinking all those years. What made me choose them? What made me spare you? I don't care about your psychology, I lied. I just want to bring those people home to their families. You're lying, Finch said, smiling wider. You've spent 28 years wondering why you survived. Why you ran when others didn't. Whether it was luck or instinct or divine intervention. It's eaten at you, hasn't it? Survivor's guilt mixed with the narcissistic need to believe you were special somehow. He was right, and I hated him for it. I'll tell you why you lived, Sarah. Not because you were smart or lucky, because I let you live. I saw you at that bus stop, saw the fear in your eyes, and I made a choice. I wanted one to get away, one witness to spend her whole life knowing I existed, knowing I was out there hunting. I thought it would be amusing. The rage I felt was incandescent. You're lying. Am I? Think about it. If I'd really wanted you, you never would have made it to Mrs. Henderson's door. I'm faster than a 9-year-old girl. I could have grabbed you in the yard. But I let you run because your terror was entertaining. Because I liked the idea of you growing up haunted. I wanted to believe he was lying, playing one final mind game. But a terrible part of me wondered if it was true. If my survival hadn't been courage or instinct, but just another manifestation of Finch's cruelty. Where are the bodies? I asked again, voice shaking. Finch leaned back in his chair. I'll tell you where to find 3 more. Just 3, the rest stay buried. And in exchange, you publish my story exactly as I tell it to you. No editorializing, no psychological analysis, just my words. No deal? I'm not giving you a platform. Then those 3 families never get closure. Their loved ones stay buried in unmarked graves forever. Your choice, Sarah. Are you willing to sacrifice their peace to deny me a voice? It was the cruelest choice he could have given me. Exactly the kind of sadistic game he'd played his entire life. I wanted to walk out, to refuse to participate in his manipulation. But I thought about Marcus Hendricks sobbing over his brother's grave, about David finally getting closure about his mother, about the family still waiting, still hoping for answers. Fine, I said. 3 victims, 3 locations, and I publish your statement, but I get to include expert psychological analysis afterward. Those are my terms. Finch considered, then nodded. Acceptable. He gave me 3 locations, 2 in Ohio, 1 in Pennsylvania. All of them were now buried under development, but excavatable. As we finished the interview and guards came to take him back to his cell, Finch stood and looked at me one last time. "You're just like me, you know," he said. "Obsessed with death, defined by trauma, spending your whole life chasing ghosts. The only difference is you pretend your obsession is noble." They led him away before I could respond. I sat in that empty interview room for 20 minutes afterward, trying to process what he'd said, trying to separate his psychological warfare from truth. Maybe he was right. Maybe I'd let Finch define my life as much as David once had. But unlike Finch, I'd used that obsession to help people, to bring closure, to stop further harm. That had to count for something. The 3 locations Finch provided were excavated over the following months. All 3 contained human remains, exactly as he'd promised. 3 more families got closure. 3 more stories reached their ending. But Finch's words haunted me. Was I really different from him, or was I just another person whose life had been warped by 1995's terrible summer? The book I wrote about the Finch case became a bestseller. I donated every penny to families of missing persons, funding private investigations and search efforts. It felt like the right thing to do, using Finch's story to help other people find closure he'd stolen. But success in journalism is seductive. My editor at the magazine offered me a position investigating cold cases full-time. "You have a gift for this," she said, "for finding patterns others miss, for connecting dots across years and jurisdictions. We could solve dozens of cases with you at the helm." I almost said yes, but something David had said at his wedding stayed with me. Robert Finch doesn't get to define my story anymore. I'd spent 28 years defined by that morning at the bus stop. Every decision I'd made, becoming a journalist, investigating missing persons, obsessing over patterns and connections, all of it traced back to the day I'd run instead of getting in the car. Finch had told me he'd let me live as entertainment, as a witness to his existence. And whether that was true or not, I'd given him exactly what he wanted. A life consumed by fear and trauma, dedicated entirely to understanding him. It was time to stop. I turned down the job offer and moved back to Millbrook. Not to relive trauma, but to finally let it go. I rented a small house near the community center where Jimmy and Melissa had been found and buried. Every morning I walked past their memorial, a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen, taken too soon, never forgotten." I started volunteering at the elementary school, teaching creative writing to 4th graders. Kids the same age I'd been when my life changed. Some of them knew my story. It was impossible to keep it secret in a small town. But most just saw me as Miss Mitchell, the writer who helped them tell stories. One student, a shy girl named Emma, wrote a story about a monster who lived in her closet. "But the monster isn't scary," she explained. "He's actually lonely and sad, and when the girl in my story becomes his friend, he stops being a monster and becomes just a person." I thought about Finch, about whether evil was something you were born with or something that grew from loneliness and pain and 1,000 small choices to hurt rather than heal. I didn't have an answer, but I hoped Emma would grow up believing that monsters could become people again, that redemption was possible, that the world wasn't irredeemably broken. Detective Walsh retired 2 years after Finch's conviction. At his retirement party, he pulled me aside. "I've been doing this job for 40 years, he said. Seen a lot of terrible things, failed to solve a lot of cases. But the Finch case, Sarah, you gave me the ending I needed to be able to walk away. You gave those families closure when the system couldn't. Thank you for not giving up." "Thank you for believing me," I said. "For taking a chance on a crazy journalist and an obsessed son and a guilt-ridden supervisor with a wild theory." Walsh smiled. "Sometimes the crazy theories are the only ones that make sense." He moved to Florida with his wife, finally getting the peaceful retirement he'd earned. But he called me once a month, checking in, making sure I was okay. He'd become a father figure I hadn't known I needed. Marcus Hendricks created a foundation in Thomas's name, funding search efforts for missing persons. He hired forensic anthropologists and ground-penetrating radar experts, using technology to locate bodies in places police couldn't afford to excavate. In the 5 years after Finch's conviction, the Hendricks Foundation helped locate 17 missing persons across 6 states. Catherine and David had twins, a boy and a girl they named Thomas and Darlene. When they asked me to be the godmother, I cried for an hour. Those children would grow up knowing the stories of the people they were named for, knowing that love and sacrifice and the determination to seek justice could overcome even the darkest evil. McKay struggled for a while after Finch's conviction. 27 years of guilt doesn't disappear with a guilty verdict. He went to therapy, joined a support group for people living with trauma, slowly learned to forgive himself for the choices he'd made out of fear. Eventually, he started giving talks to construction workers about recognizing signs of criminal activity on job sites. "If you see something wrong, speak up," he'd tell them. "Even if you're scared, even if the consequences seem overwhelming, because silence enables evil, and living with that knowledge is worse than any consequence you might face for speaking up." I attended one of his talks and watched him stand before a crowd of burly construction workers, telling them about the biggest mistake of his life and the decades he'd spent trying to make it right. At the end, a young worker raised his hand. "You said you stayed silent because he threatened your kids. Isn't that justified? Protecting your family comes first, right?" McKay was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to think that. But here's what I learned. When we stay silent to protect our own families, other people's families suffer." Darlene Kozak had kids too. Thomas Hendricks had parents and a brother. Every victim had people who loved them. By protecting my daughters from a threat, I failed to protect other people's daughters from a killer. That's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. The room was silent. Then the young worker nodded. "Thank you for being honest." After the talk, McKay and I got coffee. "How are you doing?" I asked. "Better," he said. "Some days I can almost believe I deserve to be happy. Other days, the guilt swallows me whole. But I'm learning to live with it. Learning that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing differently, going forward." We sat in companionable silence, 2 people who'd spent years haunted by the same monster, finally learning to exist in a world where he was caged and powerless. 5 years after Finch's conviction, I received a letter from him. I almost threw it away unopened. But curiosity, that same curiosity that had driven my investigation, made me read it. The letter was handwritten, surprisingly neat. Sarah, you never published my statement. You broke our deal. I've been thinking about that. About why you'd sacrifice those 3 victims' families to deny me a voice. And I realized you couldn't publish it because I told you the truth about why you survived. And you can't stand for other people to know that your survival was my gift, not your triumph. You've built your entire identity on being the one who got away, the survivor, the hero. But you're not a hero, Sarah. You're just the one I chose to let live. And deep down, you know it. Every time you celebrate surviving, every time you tell your story, you're celebrating the whim of a serial killer. How does that feel? Does it make your bestseller taste bitter? Does it keep you awake at night? I hope it does. I hope you spend the rest of your life wondering if anything you've accomplished means anything, given that it's all built on my mercy. Sweet dreams. Robert Finch. I read the letter 3 times, feeling anger and fear and something else I couldn't name. Then I took it outside and burned it in my fire pit, watching his words curl and blacken and turn to ash. He was trying one final time to colonize my mind, to make me doubt everything I'd built. And maybe there was a grain of truth in what he said. Maybe I'd built my life on that moment at the bus stop. Maybe I did define myself by survival. But Finch was wrong about one thing. It didn't matter why I survived. What mattered was what I did with the life I'd been given. I'd used that life to stop him, to bring closure to families, to turn trauma into purpose. That wasn't his gift. That was my choice. I never responded to his letter, never gave him the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten to me. Instead, I did something I should have done years ago. I wrote a different kind of story. Not about murder or missing persons or the darkness humans are capable of. Instead, I wrote a children's book about a little girl who learned to trust her instincts, who discovered that fear could be a guide rather than a prison, who survived something scary and grew up to help others do the same. The book was called The Girl Who Ran. I dedicated it to Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen, to Thomas Hendricks and Darlene Kozak, to all the people who didn't get to run and build lives and turn trauma into triumph. Emma, my student from the creative writing class, was the first kid to read it. She came to school the next day with tears in her eyes. "Miss Mitchell," she said, "this is you. You're the girl in the story." "Yeah," I admitted, "I am." "Did you really escape from a bad man?" "I did." Emma thought about this seriously. Then she said, "I'm glad you ran, because if you hadn't run, you wouldn't be here to teach us writing. And I really like your class." It was such a simple statement, but it cracked something open in my chest. All these years, I'd been focused on the people who didn't survive, feeling guilty for living when they died. But Emma was right. My survival had meaning beyond Finch's intentions. I'd taught kids to tell stories. I'd helped families find closure. I'd lived a life that mattered. Finch hadn't given me that. I'd built it myself, brick by brick, word by word, choice by choice. 10 years after Finch's conviction, I got a call from the prison. He'd died. Cardiac arrest, sudden and complete. No suffering, which felt like a final injustice. Men like him should suffer for what they'd done. But the universe doesn't work on our sense of fairness. They asked if I wanted to claim the body for burial. I said no. Robert Finch had taken up enough space in the world. He didn't deserve a grave that people could visit, a marker that would memorialize his existence. The state cremated him and scattered his ashes in an unmarked location. Good riddance. But his death brought something unexpected. Closure. Not just for me, but for all of us who'd been defined by his crimes. As long as Finch was alive, there was always the possibility he'd reveal more burial locations, provide more answers, continue to manipulate from prison. His death ended that. Whatever secrets he'd kept died with him. Marcus took the news quietly. "I don't know how to feel," he admitted when I called him. Relief that he's gone, anger that he died without telling us where all the bodies are, guilt that I'm relieved. It's all mixed up. "It doesn't have to make sense," I told him. "Grief and trauma never do. Just feel what you feel." The memorial service for Finch's known victims was held in Millbrook, at the community park that had once been the fairgrounds where Thomas disappeared. Over 200 people attended. Families, investigators, journalists, survivors of other crimes who'd followed our story and found hope in it. David spoke first, talking about his mother and how she died trying to do the right thing. "Darlene Kozak saw something wrong and tried to fix it," he said. "That's heroism. That's what I want people to remember. Not how she died, but how she lived with integrity and courage." Marcus spoke about Thomas, about the brother who'd called him that night, spooked by a man watching the dunk tank. "I've spent years wishing I'd told Thomas to leave immediately, to get away from that man, but I can't change the past. All I can do is honor Thomas by living the way he did, with kindness and optimism and the belief that people are basically good." Catherine spoke about Amanda Bishop, the woman whose disappearance had been the final link in the chain that caught Finch. "Amanda didn't get to be saved," Catherine said. "She died before we figured out the pattern. But her death meant something because it helped us stop Finch before he could kill again. I wish she'd lived. God, I wish they'd all lived. But their deaths mattered. They stopped a monster." When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium with no notes, no prepared remarks. I just spoke from my heart. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I began. "And I'm the one who ran for 10 years. I've been telling the story of that morning at the bus stop. I've written articles and books and given interviews about surviving Robert Finch. But today I want to tell a different story. This isn't a story about a serial killer. It's a story about the people who loved his victims. About Marcus Hendricks, who spent 28 years searching for his brother and never gave up. About David Kozak, who carried his mother's journal for decades, waiting until he was brave enough to pursue justice. About Gerald McKay, who lived with crushing guilt, but still spent years trying to make things right. About Detective Walsh, who never closed the case even when everyone else had moved on. It's a story about Catherine Wells, who agreed to risk her life to stop someone from hurting others. About Emma, a fourth grader who reminded me that survival has meaning beyond trauma. Robert Finch took a lot from us. He took people we loved. He took years of peace and safety. He took our innocence about the world. But he didn't take everything. He didn't take our capacity for love, for hope, for choosing every day to build something good from something terrible. I ran from Robert Finch in 1995, and I've spent 30 years running toward something better, toward justice, toward healing, toward a life that means more than just survival. I hope that's what all of us can do. Keep running, but not from fear anymore. Run toward love, toward connection, toward meaning. The people we lost, they're not defined by how they died. They're defined by how they lived and how we choose to honor them. Thomas Hendricks was kind. Darlene Kozak had integrity. Jimmy Parsons and Melissa Chen were just kids who deserved to grow up and have families and careers and mundane Monday mornings. We can't bring them back, but we can live lives that honor their memory. We can be the people they deserve to know. We can build a world where the next Robert Finch is caught sooner, where fewer families have to endure decades of not knowing. That's my promise to everyone we lost. I'll keep running, not away anymore, but toward light, toward hope, toward a future where this kind of story becomes harder to tell because we've learned to see the monsters before they can hunt. The crowd was silent when I finished. Then Marcus started clapping, and everyone joined in. It wasn't applause for me, it was applause for survival, for perseverance, for refusing to let evil have the last word. After the service, an elderly woman approached me. "I'm Thomas Hendricks' mother," she said. "I wanted to thank you for never forgetting him, for finding him and bringing him home so I could bury my boy before I died." We stood there crying together. Two women connected by tragedy and the refusal to surrender to it. 5 more years passed. The Hendricks Foundation had helped locate 43 missing persons. David and Catherine's twins started kindergarten. McKay published a memoir about his experiences that became required reading in criminal justice programs. Detective Walsh died peacefully in his sleep at 89, surrounded by family, his last case finally closed. I published 2 more books, one about the psychology of survivors, another about the families who never stopped searching. Both were dedicated to the people who didn't make it home. On the 20th anniversary of Finch's conviction, I returned to the bus stop where it all started. Someone had installed a small memorial there, a bench with a plaque reading, "In memory of all who were lost, in honor of all who survived." I sat on that bench and thought about the 9-year-old girl I'd been, arguing with her mother about recycling, completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. If I could go back and tell her anything, what would I say? Maybe, "You're going to be okay. You're going to survive more than just this morning. You're going to survive the guilt and the fear and the years of wondering why. You're going to turn this terrible thing into something meaningful. You're going to help people. You're going to matter." Or maybe I just say, "Run. Trust your instincts. Run." A car pulled up. Marcus, coming to meet me as we'd planned. He got out and sat beside me on the bench. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it. For the first time in 40 years, I was actually okay. "You know what I realized?" Marcus said. "For years, I thought the story of Thomas's disappearance was a tragedy, just pure, senseless tragedy. But that's not the whole story. The whole story includes what came after, how you and David and McKay and everyone else refused to let it stay unsolved, how we fought for justice and actually got it, how we turned grief into purpose." "That's a better story," I agreed. "It's the true story," Marcus corrected. "The tragedy was one chapter. We got to write the rest." We sat in comfortable silence, watching kids walk to school, parents waving goodbye. Completely normal morning scenes playing out where once something terrible had almost happened. My phone buzzed. A text from Emma, who was in college, now studying journalism. "Just turned in my investigative reporting project. Used everything you taught me. Thanks for being my teacher, Miss Mitchell. You changed my life." I smiled and texted back, "You changed mine too." That's the thing about survival. It's not just about the person who makes it through. It's about everyone that person touches afterward. All the lives influenced by the decision to keep living, to keep fighting, to turn trauma into testimony. Robert Finch thought letting me live would be entertaining, that I'd spend my life haunted by him. But he was wrong. I'd spent my life proving that survivors are stronger than their trauma, that families never stop loving the people they've lost, that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing. In the end, the story of 1995 wasn't about Robert Finch at all. It was about everyone who refused to let him win. It was about Marcus's dedication and David's courage, and McKay's redemption and Catherine's willingness to risk everything for strangers. It was about Detective Walsh's refusal to give up, and Emma's simple reminder that my life mattered beyond trauma. It was about the girl who ran and spent 40 years learning that survival wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose every single day to do something meaningful with the life you'd been given. Marcus and I left the memorial bench and walked to breakfast at the diner. On the way, we passed the community center where Jimmy and Melissa's memorial stood. We stopped there, like we always did, and stood in silence for a moment. "Do you think they'd be proud of us?" Marcus asked. "Everyone we lost. Do you think they'd be glad we spent our lives fighting for them?" "I think," I said carefully, "they'd want us to be happy, to live full lives, not just lives defined by their absence. But yeah, I think they'd be proud. We didn't forget them. We never stopped looking for answers, and we made sure Robert Finch didn't get away with what he did." "Good," Marcus said. "That's what I needed to hear." We continued to the diner, where David and Catherine were waiting with their twins, Thomas and Darlene, 6 years old now, bright and curious and completely innocent of the darkness their names carried. "Aunt Sarah," little Darlene shouted, running to hug me. "We're learning about journalists in school. I told everyone my aunt is a famous journalist who catches bad guys." I laughed and hugged her back. "I don't catch bad guys. I just tell their stories." "Same thing," she insisted with 6-year-old certainty. Maybe she was right. Maybe telling stories was a way of catching the bad guys, trapping them in narrative, ensuring they couldn't be forgotten or erased or allowed to fade into mystery. Maybe every article I wrote, every book I published, every speech I gave was another lock on the cage that held Robert Finch's legacy. We ordered breakfast and talked about normal things, school plays and work projects and vacation plans. The kids spilled orange juice and argued about who got the window seat. David and Catherine looked at each other with the comfortable love of people who'd survived trauma together and chosen to build something beautiful from it. Marcus showed me photos from the Hendricks Foundation's latest recovery effort. A young man missing for 7 years, finally found and returned to his family. His mother cried for an hour when we told her, Marcus said. Then she said, "Thank God someone cared enough to keep looking." That's what it's all about, Sarah. Making sure people know someone cares. I looked around the table at this makeshift family we'd built from shared tragedy and survival. None of us would have chosen how we came together. But here we were, laughing over pancakes and orange juice, living lives that mattered, proving every day that love and determination could overcome even the darkest evil. The girl who ran had finally stopped running. Not because the fear was gone, it would never be completely gone, but because I'd learned that running toward something was stronger than running away from something. I'd run toward justice, toward healing, toward family and purpose, and a life bigger than trauma. And I'd made it. We all had. That's the real story of 1995's terrible summer. Not the tragedy, but the triumph. Not the monster, but the people who refused to let him define their lives. Not the darkness, but the light we chose to carry forward. As breakfast ended and we prepared to go our separate ways, back to jobs and schools and the beautiful mundanity of normal life, little Thomas tugged on my sleeve. "Aunt Sarah, can you tell me a story?" I knelt down to his level. "What kind of story?" "A happy one," he said seriously, "with a good ending." I smiled. "I think I can do that." And I did. I told him a story about a girl who learned to trust her instincts, who faced down monsters and won, who spent her life helping others and building something beautiful from something broken. I told him a story about survival and love and the unbreakable human spirit. I told him a story with a good ending, because that's what we all deserved. Not to be defined by the worst thing that ever happened to us, but by everything we built afterward. That's the story I wanted to tell. That's the story I'd lived. And after 40 years, I could finally say, the end.